All right, Living Way College. Just wanted to lay down a video here as your director. I am technically like a Christian researcher, but that was a very grassroots process for me. So I do want to share a little bit of a testimonial, essentially, right? A high school dropout's guide to writing uh, quality papers, undergraduate, and I'll do some explanation from the graduate level, but that can help you out. You connect the dots there. But before I get into that, I do want to give you some sort of, technical help and advice. So this will be attached to an email that will have some documents attached. One of them is a paper that I did, and I'll talk a little bit more about the paper. It's titled, essentially, it's a short summary of Aquinas' life and works, Thomas Aquinas, the medieval philosopher and theologian. And the CCBC Living Way College Style Guide. I know I've distributed it before. I just went through it again, read sections of it, and then there's some parts you see, you don't need to read them. You can kind of skim. It's giving you the details on how to abbreviate things and stuff like that. But I would read it, the sections that are readable, and especially like page 14 and following. That tells you how to do the footnotes and everything. So you're going to get this video with the style guide and this paper that I wrote, the short summary of Aquinas. Now, it's not required that you read the paper, although I think it would be potentially edifying for you to read it. But what you can do is just skim it and take a look at my style that I used in that paper. And I feel comfortable giving it to you because some of my papers, even at the graduate level, just weren't that great, right? But this was a paper, and I'll tell you a little bit about the history of it. When I was getting ready to do my thesis, I wrote over 250, it's like 232 pages, maybe even longer, of a thesis that I wrote on sort of the indivisibility of God. And the topic and the subject matter was higher than my understanding at the time. So I had a couple of classes that I was still taking before I went into the full thesis phase of my Master of Divinity degree. And so I used this class, I think it was a church history class, and the professor let me do this sort of summarization of Aquinas' life and works because I used Aquinas and commentaries on Aquinas for my thesis. So this paper was a learning process and whatnot. And so by this point, I have been a student off and on for 15 years, and so it's a pretty decent representation of the level of paper writing that I could do. It was probably at the higher point on the spectrum of things, right? So feel free to just take a look at how I did my paragraphs and my indentations. So here's a tip on indentation, right? Typically, for your normal paragraphs, you're supposed to indent the front line. I do 7 indentations, which I think is in accordance with the Chicago style or the Living Way College style guide. But a trick to remember is, right, the airplane, 747. So I think a acceptable indentations are anywhere from 7 to 4 spaces. I do 7, just remember 747. And pick one, right? 4, 5, 6, 7 spaces and stick with it. Stay consistent. I do 7. I like the number 7. And you'll see that, 7 indentations. And you can see the way that I did footnotes progressively. And I reviewed the style guide that I give y'all. And there's not much difference between the paper that I wrote and the style guide. There's one subtle thing. You'll notice on my title page, I included the degree program I was on and the professor I was submitting the paper to. So no big deal. You could choose to do one or the other with the papers you turn in to our school. And so you'll see some subtle differences there. And then also, too, I actually edited the style guide, although I didn't make it into the acknowledgments section. I don't care, really, but the pre-existing style guide, when I looked at it in 2016, I think, I was like, oh, man, there were errors and contradictions and improper things in the style guide. So I made some corrections. And then a guy, Lucas, who was in the registrar's office at the time, he made further corrections. So it's pretty good, although there's still errors in it, believe it or not. And one thing that I tried to get them to change is the way that they do their ellipses. Now, an ellipsis is when you're editing out part of a quote and you go dot, dot, dot. So you may want to look at the way that I did my ellipses and not pay close attention to the way that the style guide did. They do those informal ones where they're compact. You need to space them out. And I went through the paper again before I gave it to you, and even after me poring over it for hours, printing it out, having a proofreader read it, make corrections, find spelling errors and punctuation problems and stuff, give it back to me, make those corrections. I turned it into a professor. I got an A on the paper. So that's why I want you to see that paper. If you want to know how to get an A, you can look at that paper and listen to what I'm saying right now. And so I got the A on the paper and I got it back, and years later, because I wrote it in 2013, 2014. I'm like, oh wow, there were some double spaces. I had ibid in the footnotes. I needed to capitalize. I had used lowercase and things like that. There were some things that I still needed to kind of fix, and that's just kind of the way that papers go. I don't think they're ever perfect. You just get to a point where it's good enough, and if you want to get an A, you think, okay, this is good enough to get an A, and you turn it in. So, and I'm actually going to share a bit of a testimony of how I got to that level of being able to write, to get an A paper from like writing terrible papers 20 years ago. So, just some requests. Please stop. Please get out of the habit of turning in rough drafts to me or any of the other teachers here at Living Way College. I can tell when it's a rough draft. I can tell when you haven't taken the time to go back through it with a fine-tooth comb yourself, and also when you haven't printed it out or at least sent it as an e-file to a second set of eyes to read and make corrections and give back to you, where you implement those corrections and read it again and then finally turn it in. That needs to be done in order to get an A. If you don't do that and you turn in a rough draft, if it was a really great rough draft, I could maybe give you a C. Just about the best I can do when somebody turns in a rough draft is give you a grace D, even if your content is good, right? And the content is the most important point. But what I tell college students all the time is the crazy thing about college is all that college that you have to do. These are academic papers. Our school does have an academic standard. And God doesn't use poor grammar and syntax and whatnot in his Bible, right? Now, we're going to fall short of that standard, but that doesn't mean that we have some loose license when we're doing college papers to just be handing in rough drafts and things like that. So please get out of the habit of that. Now, I know how it is. Sometimes you're trying to meet a deadline, and it is better to turn something in than nothing. But yeah, the best you can get, theoretically, is a C. You're more precisely going to get a D, which is not a passing grade. If you get a D in a class, you have to get a C minus or better to pass a class. So anyway, so please stop doing that, handing in rough drafts. If you've done that, don't get all upset. I'm not picking on you or targeting you. I've done crazier stuff, but just please get out of that habit. Don't develop a habit of doing that. Please take the time to do proper footnotes. If I've graded any of your papers, you'll see when you're not using consistent terminal punctuation that's required for footnotes, I'm tagging it. And if it's just, honest errors, then, I'm not going to ding you. But if you're just flagrantly not doing proper footnotes, you could come down a whole grade and a half. Again, that's sort of, if you don't have good footnotes, you're essentially in the rough draft sort of thing. So you're looking at a C minus, D plus, D. Basically, if the footnotes are just bad or not good. And you need a title page, your paper, and then the bibliography. And you'll see the attached files actually are the way that I used to turn in my papers. The title page, then the body, and then the bibliography. Now, there might be a problem with my bibliography. I think technically I ought to have also put in the web resources that I used. So that's just something to keep in mind, especially in these shorter papers that you're doing, to also include the web resources that you're using, or any resource actually, should also be in your bibliography. I just got out of that habit doing the grad papers for various reasons, and would get away with it. But any source that you use should go in your bibliography, especially in these short papers where you're using 2 or 3 sources. I think that's the requirement. If you're using 4 or 5 or 6 sources, get them all in that bibliography. It'll look a little thicker than just having a couple of references there. So anyway, again, it's not required, but I think you would benefit by reading the paper. Or at least you can just go look at the footnotes, the way that I did them, the way that I have my paragraphs, the way I did an introduction, and the way I have a body of work, and then a conclusion, right? Even though your papers are shorter, you do an introduction, paragraph or 2, your body of work, 2 or 3 or 4 paragraphs, and then a conclusion, a paragraph or 2, right? Just sort of 3 sections. That's enough to get you anywhere from 4 to 8 or 9 pages, the range of undergraduate requirement of length of paper that we're doing here with the school. And I think that you get that. So here's sort of the testimonial side of things. I dropped out of 2 high schools. I dropped out of one, and I got politely asked to not come back to a second one, right? And then I just, so academics was really never my thing. I had some high points here and there, but or some achievements, but those were the exception. They weren't the norm. I did poorly in school. And then when I became a Christian, I knew that reading was important. And then when I went to Bible college the first year that I was a Christian, that writing was important. And again, I wrote really poor papers. I actually graduated with my associate degree from Calvary Chapel Bible College without really being able to write a paper very well. And that was just sort of the vibe of the school then, was more of a devotional type of tip, and they didn't care, which I get, whatever. Christianity is unique in that it's a spiritual kind of thing. But when I went to my second undergraduate degree, my mentor was a grammarian, right? And he was all over me, and he helped me get a little bit better at writing papers. And so I did some okay work with him. And then I went to Southern Evangelical Seminary, where I got my first B in the graduate level, which hurt my pride. And then I had a New Testament professor just pour red ink over one of my papers, and he lectured the whole class saying, okay, guys and gals, get your act together. This is academics. God sees your work. We want to strive for excellence. And he wasn't being a jerk. He made those marks on our papers to help us out. And I read what he wrote and started to make the changes. And I, at that point, needed to make an investment into a better word processing program. So again, welcome to college. You got to do some college. So if you're using WordPad or some, archaic type of word processor, it's going to affect you. Now, if budget-wise, you can't afford anything better right now because some of these things are costly, talk to me. We can work something out. You can do, parenthetical references and stuff like that. As long as your paper writing is good, you can make that kind of contract with me. But most people have access to Microsoft Word or whatever, and that's kind of what you need in order to format these things properly. And read the style guide. It'll just tell you that Microsoft Word by default has the proper margins and will sort of default you to New Times Roman, 12-point font. Your papers need to be double spaced and all that. That's in the style guide. And I have to confess, I've been sort of lazy and pointing y'all to the hack. You ask me a question, I say, well, just Google search Chicago style. Now, that's a hack you can do later, but I think it's important for you to go through and read the style guide if you haven't yet, and then take a look at the paper that I've given you as well. So, didn't do anything substantial at CCBC or Columbia Evangelical Seminary. I got a little better. I started writing a bit better papers when I was involved in SES. And then Veritas is where I was able to really start grinding out papers. I became sort of good at just knocking out 20 to 25 to 30 page papers in a way where I could pretty much get an A or an A minus or whatever, and so that's the question I'm asking you. Do you want to be an English major or do you want to get an A paper? So just have those footnotes, kind of properly done, your paragraphs proper, your block quotes proper and indented, your introduction, your titles and your subheadings, and your cover page, your pagination, your bibliography. You're not copying me by emulating my style. And so you just see, because I got my style from the history of authors that use paragraphs and indentations and rely on Chicago style as their standard and whatnot. So, and I'll tell you a story here, and then I'll kind of wrap it up because I see the video is getting a little bit long. When I first got to CCBC, Calvary Chapel Bible College, Marietta, fall of 2000, there was an English class. And the way that they had it set up was you, as a new student, you had to sit and sort of write out a 3 or 4 page paper in one sitting, just kind of off the top of your head. I think they gave us a topic, or we could pick a topic. We just had to do a writing sample. And if you didn't pass that standard there with regards to the writing sample that you turned in, you had to take this English class. So I was like, I need to learn about English. I want to take that class. And everyone's like, no, you don't. Because I think the professor wasn't like an English major. He was kind of winging it is a better term there. And they're like, no, seriously, you don't want to take that class. It's just not that great of a class. It's kind of boring and is not as helpful as they would like it to be. So I was like, okay, what do I do? So it was closed book, this sort of write out some kind of essay and turn it in. But they said you can use your Bible. And by use your Bible, I just took it beyond just referencing scriptures. I just honed in on how Paul was writing. And I essentially copied his style with the words I was using, the way that Paul had made his paragraphs. I'm pretty sure I was using Paul, one of the epistles. So you could say, hey, what's up with that? Well, no, they said I could use the Bible. And I just essentially quoted scriptures, and when I did, I quoted them, and then I used my own words, but then I copied the way that Paul, the Apostle Paul, had done his paragraphs, and that was enough to pass that class. So all that to say, do that. Look how Paul, especially, how he argues, right, for points, and introduces them and has a body of sort of argument and counter-argument, makes conclusions, right? You can totally emulate that. You can take a look at my paper, see how I did paragraphs, indented block quotes, footnotes, and all of that. So this has been the sort of high school dropouts advice on how to get an A paper. Am I a grammarian? Am I an English major? No, but I have 1, 2, 3, 4 degrees, a couple of them with honors, and that's what you want to do, right? You want to get your degree, you want to get good grades or the best grades you can in class, and hopefully this has been helpful to you. God bless you. Have a great remainder of the semester and remainder of the year. Take care.